and welcome to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey. And this week, I'm really happy to welcome onto the program the Reverend Dr. Lisa Dahill. Lisa, thank you so much for making time for us.
So happy to be here, Sam. That's a big honor.
Oh, yeah. Well, geez, the honor's all mine. And for folks who don't know you, you're a professor of transformative leadership and spirituality and the director of the Center for Transformative Spirituality at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, which I'm looking forward to hearing more about. It sounds like a pretty cool private theological university, and you're there in Hartford, Connecticut. And but first, before we get into that, one of the things I'm always really curious, and people who have seen the podcast before or listened to it know that I always ask people this, is the kind of autobiography of how you got into the work you do for a couple reasons. Both why Reverend and Doctor? You know, are you just trying to show off? What's going on there? And because I could see a lot of people kind of choose one or the other of those paths. And then likewise, why focus on religion and its relationship to nature and ecology and those kinds of things? Because again, a lot of people choose one of those and often think they're very disparate in their way, like you can't fuse these. And of course, the Forum on Religion Ecology is all about bringing those together. So I'm curious, how in your life, what was it that made you want to do both of those things, the Reverend Doctor and religion and ecology?
Yeah, that's great. I haven't been asked about the Reverend and Doctor in that way before. Although people do often ask about religion and ecology, as you know. So I did my PhD in Berkeley at the Graduate Theological Union in Christian spirituality. I loved that. I went off to be a professor of Christian spirituality and also worship at a Lutheran seminary in Ohio, and loved that. Was fully into the joy of teaching out of this tradition that I was so immersed in and that I found so meaningful and powerful. And I'm ordained in the Lutheran Church as well. So I, had been to seminary and was a parish pastor. So that whole trajectory toward being a seminary professor just was very organic, and went really deep in terms of my own personal journey through grad school and divorce and psychoanalysis and monastic, immersion and really great worshiping communities. And I came to teach out of all of that and loved it. And then in my 7th year, I had sabbatical from the seminary in Ohio, and I went off to this place called Holden Village in the North Cascade Mountains of Washington, which is a Lutheran, but also totally open, eclectic, wild community, way up in the mountains with no road and no, way to get there except on a 3-mile boat ride up Lake Chelan, and then a bus coming down, and it's completely out in the mountains. This community, this year-round community, it's full of strange and wonderful people and energy and hilarity, and I went there to be poet in residence during Advent in winter, out of the desire to bring into my scholarly work my love of the earth and the world. And I'd grown up, camping. My parents were big backpackers and campers and recyclers, and I grew up with this whole ecological love, but I'd never connected it fully with my scholarship. So I thought this sabbatical is my chance, to connect all this. And so I went to be poet in residence and to write ecological poems out of the antiphons, the monastic antiphons of Advent, and to do that in this amazing community. And while I was there, I experienced this big, what Bill Plotkin calls eco-awakening, that happened in a big way for me in that month, and specifically out on a hike up in the mountains, about 2 miles from the village by myself on a day with fresh snowfall, and experienced, and in the midst of all this beauty, and suddenly saw bear tracks coming toward me, and realized the bear was now between me and the village, and turned around and saw its claws emerging from my boot print, and got this big sense of my own animality, of the wildness of the place, of this intelligence, this bear intelligence out there and with me, and the sense of the whole world alive, and I just fell into it and never really came back in. So I couldn't really come back indoors, and began to find indoor worship less compelling, even though I was a worship professor, and found my energy and my teaching and my passion just moving completely outdoors. So I developed this project, and just really because I was the worship professor of trying to see what happens when we move everything outdoors, when we move the sacrament of baptism out into local waters, when we move the practice of Eucharist out into relationship with questions of predation, when we move the practice of Lectio Divina out into listening to the world and Book of Nature and all of the, the speaking earth and animism. And so I was just reading voraciously and in that sabbatical year, and then just beginning to develop when I came back from sabbatical, just, let's do this, let's try that. And students loving it and finding a lot of energy and resonance with people just loving the creativity of all of that, and naming the renunciations at the font or the creedal confessions in ecological terms that are particular, that are place-based, and that come out of the actual interspecies relationships we're experiencing right now, the students and I, that kind of thing. And what happens when liturgy emerges from place, not moving outdoors what we do indoors and chairs and rows and extension cords for keyboards, but like letting the liturgical language itself emerge, and actions and gestures and presence emerge from the place and be in relationship with the place, and the creatures and the trees and the waters are part of the worshiping community, all that kind of stuff. So I was just sort of making it up. Like I didn't know there were people doing this already, or I didn't know who they were initially. I was just trying it myself and seeing, and reading, like crazy, trying to connect and learn, and finding, really resonant thinkers and allies. And after about 4 more years, finding I needed to be in a place that was more interdisciplinary and interreligious. So I moved back to Southern California, where I had grown up, and was doing religious studies at an undergraduate context. And in this whole interdisciplinary world where there were, geologists and poets and all kinds of people that I could talk to and stretch my thinking. And it was a completely interreligious student context. So learning to teach in these whole new ways. So that's more of that's like the doctor's, that's like the reverend giving way to the doctor, you could say, kind of like I wasn't there it wasn't like teaching at a seminary where I was coming out of that whole reverend side, in my teaching. But then this position came open, and it's this chance to teach here at Hartford in this school that used to be called Hartford Seminary, and now it's Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, because it's an interreligious school, seminary, theological school, and has been interreligious for 40 or 50 years. That part's not new. Yeah. But so it's this super creative place, and a chance to come back to theological education, but in an interreligious way and in this earth-centered way, and to be kind of the one who's helping HIU learn to move, to let our interness, which has been so powerful as interreligious, to stretch even further, to start living into what it might mean to be interspecies, inter kind of everything. So they're letting me develop programs and initiatives and courses that align with that. And we're actually developing new ecological or pathways to be doing study of religion and ecology in all of our master's programs now, or our primary master's programs. We have a program in chaplaincy, for instance, that's just launching a new track in eco-chaplaincy. So people can come here and do eco-chaplaincy studies, which is so awesome. And same with our interreligious studies masters. We have now a concentration in religion and ecology, and our Doctor of Ministry program also, religion and ecology. You can come here and do religion and ecology in this totally interreligious context that's open to people of all different traditions and no tradition, and all different kinds of contexts for what ministry means. So it's a very fun place because it has this history of creativity and wanting to kind of be on the cutting edge. They stopped being a Christian seminary in the late 70s, early 80s, realizing that the world didn't need so many freestanding Christian seminaries. Why don't we be interreligious? Like, that was really new then, and is still super important. So this is a school that wants to be doing creative new stuff, and so we draw students who also want to do creative new stuff, and it's a really fun place to teach that kind of allows the reverend and the doctor, you could say, to come together, because I'm not here as a Lutheran pastor, as like I was at the seminary, but nevertheless, it's theological education just from this completely eclectic and diverse set of standpoints, where um, everyone's a seeker and everyone's engaging these meaning-making questions from inside their own context and appreciating one another's. So that's my
Nice.
short answer.
That's great. I know, right? Yeah. It's always a tough question to ask because I'm basically asking for your whole life story.
Yes.
And so you're like, well, there's a short answer, there's a long answer, and there's an autobiographical whole context where you're like, I've got a few hundred pages to
Yeah.
to express this. Yeah, and there's so many parts of that I want to elaborate on. Uh, One, going back to California, knowing you grew up in California and you went to the Graduate Theological Union to do doctoral work. Of course, I'm based in California, which I think confuses some people because I host a podcast for the Yale Forum on
Yeah.
Religion Ecology. People are like, oh, so how's New Haven? And I'm like, oh, no, I'm not in Connecticut. And I work remotely. And I love the Bay Area a lot. But I went to the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco to do my doctoral work. And so I kind of heard about the Graduate Theological Union, but I never really figured out a whole lot about it. So I wonder if you could share a little about like what California means to you in general, knowing you grew up here and have taught here and done work, but also the GTU, especially for listeners or viewers who might be thinking themselves about graduate work.
Yeah. Yeah, great question. So yeah, I'm a native Californian. I grew up in Southern California, got out and went to college in Minnesota, swore I would never come back. I didn't really feel like a Southern Californian and felt much more at home in other parts of the country and the world. But the Bay Area I loved, and it felt like kind of coming home to California to the pieces that I had really loved and appreciated, like ponderosa pines and the scent of pine and the forest ecosystems. I'd kind of grown up in the mountains too, I mentioned. So really loving the Sierras and the mountains of Southern California. And so, coming home, it felt like coming home in the Bay Area, but to a place that felt more intellectually diverse and welcoming. And then the pieces of Southern California I'd grown up in. And just really loved the GTU. I have to say, like it felt like the first time in my life I'd felt this space to go as deep as possible. Like my whole job in life was to think as deeply and broadly and precisely as I could. And I loved all of it. And the fact that the programs involve a lot of creativity, like I designed my own comprehensive exams, which I'm sure many schools do, but I appreciated the way the program was set up to allow for a lot of flexibility, and as well as the fact that the ecumenical and also somewhat interreligious even then nature of the GTU meant that there just was a lot of cross-disciplinary, cross-tradition conversation, like every class and the whole doctoral cohort and the doctoral faculty, and everybody was just a huge diversity of traditions and voices. So yeah, I appreciated that because I was in Christian spirituality, and the only other programs in that area were primarily Catholic based. So I really appreciated there being this program in Christian spirituality that was so ecumenical and so open in interreligious ways too. One of our doctoral comps was to be in a tradition that was other than Christian, and that was really? in the early 90s, when that probably wasn't the case in every doctoral program in the country. And so I just really loved that. And of course, living in Berkeley, what's not to love? Super stimulating place to live, and beautiful, and so much culture and arts.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I loved it. I didn't want to leave.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's how I feel. I've been, in the Bay Area about 20 years, and a lot of that in Berkeley, but kind of bounced around a little bit. But yeah, absolutely love it. And interesting to know that the GTU was kind of one of those pioneers for paving these directions toward interreligious thought.
Yes.
And that's another thing I want to hear about, because I'm always intrigued by that, and something I'm extremely drawn to and can't not do that anymore. I've become too interreligious. And so the idea of picking one faith, it's like, well, you might have kind of a home base in a certain faith. So how do you navigate that? as a reverend, right? I mean,
Mm.
so you're like, I'm definitely rooted in a particular tradition, but you can honor these other traditions. I feel like this is, I mean, it's definitely a kind of new thing emerging in human consciousness where people are able to hold multiple
Mhm.
traditions
Yeah.
and not judge others, not try to convert them
Mhm.
necessarily.
Yes.
So how do you navigate that? The ability to maintain a Christian sensibility while also being open to,
Mm.
like you mentioned, with animism, indigenous traditions, Eastern traditions, etc.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, it's a great question, and it's definitely like, and navigating is the right verb.
Mm,
It's there's not a way, a path. With many others, as you say, I'm trying to figure this out, and so I've um, taught in, it was a seminary, and then the undergraduate school I taught in was also Lutheran, actually, and they wanted me as the Lutheran on the religion faculty when I was hired. That was part of what they wanted, and I'm a Bonhoeffer scholar, Dietrich
right.
Bonhoeffer, so that was great. But the teaching, as I said, was completely interreligious. So that was a first
Mm,
like attempt to see how does it feel to be here as Lutheran, but teaching in this completely interreligious way, and my own identity shifting toward interreligious as well. Like I
mm,
said, like the seminary context had begun to feel a little theologically small. I needed more um, interreligious connection, and my own faith is definitely like, so I'm still rostered in the ELCA, in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, in the New England Synod now, and um, but I'm not a typical pastor. In fact, when I was moving here, I talked in California before moving here. I talked to a bishop, a retired bishop in the ELCA, about this question: and should I leave the roster because I don't believe in God the Father Almighty,
right.
and I can't confess the creed in a normal way. Like, it's not true. I don't find it truthful anymore. So, and the ordination vows in the ELCA, and I vow to uphold the creeds, among other things, and I
Mm,
can't do that in the way I could when I said those vows. So should I step out of this role? Should I still be reverend or not?
mm,
And I don't want to be, lying to the church by
right.
holding on to this when I can't confess the creed
Yep.
anymore. Like, it's earth is the divine reality, not a
Mm,
separate God. So it's an increasingly animist, as I said, and even pantheistic
mm,
perspective of the holiness of all it is, and that's the divine reality. This earth itself is the divine reality. And what happens if we do Christianity where earth is the divine reality instead of a separate God? So, like, wow, then that changes what we think we mean by incarnation, and
mm,
what Jesus is all about, and what these sacraments are all about. And it's about Jesus as the one who invites Christians back into the one reality that is God and world together. Alienated Christians being invited back into reality,
yeah.
God and world, one reality. But that's not what most people, Christians, think Jesus is about,
Right.
So, so I was talking to this bishop about, should I continue, and he said, no, we need you in the
Mm,
ELCA. We need people thinking in this way in the church to stretch us and to ask us into these huge questions we're facing today, and to help us develop forms of Christianity that are not contributing to the walling off of God from world, and of sacred from not sacred, right? There's holy water, and then there's the rest of the water, all that kind of stuff. I think a lot about, having been a worship professor, I think a lot about church walls as a symbolic problem. They
mm,
create this beautiful interior space, and we need interior spaces, and we need psychic spaces, and we need wombs, and we need shelter, and we need forms of art that take place indoors, and we need forms of community where we can let down our guard. And but at the same time, like the symbolic problem of church walls, where we're conducting rituals that are for humans only, by
yeah.
humans only, worshiping a God that's kind of in a human image, even if you think it is, it kind of is still for many people. It is, and then you leave and you go out into the unholy world. Kind of, it's even if the indoor rituals are beautifully cosmologically done,
Mm,
it's still a symbolic problem. And so I find it still hard, to worship indoors. And I'm not a normal reverend, a normal pastor. And I'm much more interested in how can what we do in worship, um, the best examples of, and my own experiences of worship, which were so full of beauty and so full of love, like completely transforming, and It's not to diminish any of that. I loved all of that, and it's healed me. And it's as if it did its work and it healed me and it opened me up to the whole world full of God. And so I don't need to be back inside anymore. It did its work, as it were. And there's a sense in which every Sunday is meant to do that. Every Sunday we experience this great gift of beauty and love and being wildly loved and being part of this community and seeing the world in this whole new way of justice and nonviolence and connection and kinship and hopefully cosmology and evolution. Like hopefully that's all part of the indoor worship too. But then the idea is like that's the reality, and you leave it, but you still live there. And we live into the world that we experience in indoor. Like that's the idea, and that happened for me. So when I say I have trouble worshiping indoors, that's me. But the idea of indoor worship opening to the outdoors is there in the best indoor worship anyway. It's just for me, I need to be staying out, and I want to be part of the movement that's about those walls dissolving in perceptually and about the whole world being perceived as holy. The whole world is the sanctuary, and so that worship becomes what happens in worship becomes the whole world, and we can all just keep living here and seeing all of the creatures of the world through as part of this sanctuary, as part of this holy ground. So I'm rostered in the church, and I can't say the creed, and I'm announcing this on this podcast. So,
You get yourself into a lot of trouble.
At some point, somebody might say, you can't do that. You can't be part of the church anymore. And then that could happen. But at this point, I'm wanting to say, what happens if we do Lutheran in the creek?
Right. Yeah. And I'm glad that bishop gave you that advice, because I'm of that same mindset of like, well, but if everybody thought like you left, then the possibility of Lutheranism evolving into this more interreligious, interspecies kind of connectivity, well, then that goes right out the window.
Right.
So it's like if the faith is going to progress and make sense of itself in this new century, this new millennium, like, well, of course, we need you to stay. But I mean, I get, as somebody who's raised Catholic, at a certain point, I'm like, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty.
Yeah.
Like, who's this guy?
Yeah.
And there's so many complications with that. And I know a lot of people are like, well, what do I do if I can't say that and say it in the way that other people who say it mean it?
Yeah.
It's like, well, but maybe you're helping us understand that when we say Father, that might not be so separate from Mother. And when we say God, that might not be so separate from nature. And of course, things like animism or pantheism have been considered so heretical in the past. It's like, well, we need people to work through that, and finding like the scriptural basis for this. Like, actually, if you really read the Bible, it might be a little more animist and pantheist than you might realize.
Yes, that's right. It's just under the surface.
It is there.
Or not, or right there. But
right.
Right under the surface.
Right. If you have ears to hear it, it's right there. And well, so I want to take a step back, because you also mentioned that you're a Bonhoeffer scholar, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who I don't know if, this podcast has been going for a few years now. I don't know if we've ever brought him up, but he's such a fascinating character. I mean, fascinating is putting it mildly. And so I wonder if you could say a little about what I mean, obviously there's so much to say. But if you could say a little about what he's into, and is there kind of an ecological or cosmological sense of his work? Because I think that's one of those things people just think of the theological dimension, or his fierce criticism of Nazism and his untimely death and things like that. So it'd be wonderful to hear a little about him.
So I've been working in Bonhoeffer for a long time, since living in Tübingen in Germany, actually, and being part of a congregation that later named itself for Bonhoeffer. And I was there during the 50th anniversary year of the Barmen Declaration, and reading, engaging all that in Germany with people who are wrestling with the implications of all those years and naming their church for Bonhoeffer. And it came back and got involved in the translation project of the critical edition. Fortress has published the critical edition of Bonhoeffer's works into English. So I was one of the translators for that during my grad school years, and then did my dissertation on Bonhoeffer, which was a feminist psychoanalytic reading of Bonhoeffer around questions of selfhood and spiritual formation, and really fun and I think fruitful and interesting, opening up looking at his social location and doing a critical reading of his patriarchal tendencies, while also really appreciating many aspects of his spirituality, including some that are not visible except through this lens of reading from a different perspective. And that opened me to really be interested in this question of reading from different perspectives and then broadening that over the years. And so then the ecological dimension is like reading Bonhoeffer, in conversation with Bonhoeffer from a whole different perspective. But in that case, so I'm right now working on a book on Bonhoeffer and ecology, and there have definitely been works that engage how does he think, how does his theology, how does he talk about the natural world, and also how does his theology and ethics work in helping us confront questions of our complicity with climate change or ethical resources needed, or how do we resist the way he resisted, Nazism. And yeah, there's been some great work in that area. Larry Rasmussen worked in that area, works still in that area. Also Diane Rayson in Australia. And my own work draws on theirs and really appreciates that kind of engagement with Bonhoeffer and what he says. And actually, just a little sidebar, Karl Barth at the time of Bonhoeffer, who wrote the Barmen Declaration, was so horrified by the Nazis. And the Nazis, of course, had pro-environmental,
right,
tendencies, which made things complicated in terms of, so for Barth, you had to reject anything environmental as being pagan and potentially Nazified in that period. So he was very, so that kind of helped fuel his radical separation between God and world. Bonhoeffer was a Barthian, loved Barth and learned a lot from him, but he didn't go that route. And he was able to hold on to a very strong love of nature and the world, the natural world, while being strongly anti-Nazi. So he was able to, thread that needle, thankfully, in a way that not everyone was able to at that time. And so, so there's a lot there that Larry and Diane and many others have surfaced and are surfacing around resources in Bonhoeffer for how to think fruitfully and theologically and ethically about the natural world. But what I'm doing is a little different. It's looking at what he says in his ethics, which he wrote from the conspiracy while he was, forbidden to speak, forbidden to preach, forbidden to publish, and actively involved in the conspiracy. It kind of a little trying to stay off the radar of the Gestapo, and functioning as the foreign emissary for the conspiracy. So he's doing all this, actively in opposition to Hitler, putting his life on the line. He's going to be arrested within a year, depending on the period. He was arrested in early 1943. So in that period, he's writing his ethics. And you might think that his ethics would be all about resisting evil, and we're the side of the good, and we have to fight against evil, and we have to stand up against and put our lives on. That's how people read Bonhoeffer, in this kind of dualistic way of good against evil and God against the world, or us against Hitler, or whatever. There's people read him in this, but in his ethics, the very beginning of his ethics, the very first word, section is about how the attempt to know, for us to differentiate good and evil with our heads in some a priori way and assign categories is always going to be false. The only way to know what the good really is through Jesus Christ. And how we know Jesus Christ is as the unity of God and world. And so he makes this announcement that, that the only way we can know Jesus Christ is where God and world come together, as the place where God and world come together and are one reality, not two. And then he has this long, relatively long, several pages, discourses on how there's been a massive problem in Christianity, this colossus obstructing our way that happened early on in the earliest centuries, where God and world split apart and there became these separate realms of God, world, separate, and all this dualism. And that was a massive problem. It's caused it's the complete and total disaster, and we need to be returning over and over and over again to this unity of God and world in Jesus Christ. One reality, not two. One reality. And so, I've been sitting with that for a long time, for many decades. And after this big eco, explosion in 2011, toward what happens if I take that seriously, ecologically? God and world, one reality, not two. So it's it's fostered this desire to do a reading of Bonhoeffer that's explicitly taking this seriously as a critique of dualism, and to try to construct a Christian non-dualism, and a pantheistic, people, the word pantheism is catchphrase for anything that's taboo and off limits and wrong and bad and heretical, and so it's not a word that preaches very well.
Right.
But nevertheless, there's something very powerfully incarnational and Christological about this proposal of God and world, one reality, not two. And Jesus and Bonhoeffer, loved Jesus and was into the incarnation and Christmas, and loved, preaching on the flesh of Jesus and our shared embodiment, and Lutheranism loves the body and loves, Luther loved, talking about Jesus becoming part of our flesh. He was very Catholic that way, you might say. So it's, why can't we be pantheistic? Why is this off limits? Kind of, it's funny. And I've, learned a lot and really appreciated Mary Jane Rubenstein's work on pantheism,
right.
And sort of deconstructing all that Christian phobia of it, and diving deep into what does this look like and what does it mean. And so it's I'm proposing and doing a pantheistic reading of Bonhoeffer, but also what does that look like? What would a Christian spirituality that took seriously God and world as one reality, not two, look like and feel like? And what is the world then as the divine reality, and how do we experience that? So that's this project. So it's a reading of Bonhoeffer, but it's also a reading kind of through Bonhoeffer out into the world.
That's exciting. I know I'll definitely be tuning into that as you finish that project and get it out into the world. That's absolutely fantastic. Yeah, Bonhoeffer's one of those things. I know some people who are into it, but it's always, you can't read everything. And so he's one of those people that I'm always like, I'm always like one book away from being like, finally it's time to dive into Bonhoeffer. And really appreciate, especially his historical context. I mean, struggling against Hitler and Nazism.
Exactly.
I mean, sadly, that couldn't be more timely.
Right. And so, also, just to say, he's being co-opted on the right by people saying that he actually should be considered a spokesperson for Christian nationalism in the U.S., really? Which is unbelievably ironic and surreal, really, given how completely antithetical that is to what he was actually doing, as anyone really can see looking at his life. So it is interesting that today Bonhoeffer is being used in all kinds of different contexts. So just
interesting.
Beware what you read and by whom.
Right. Yeah. And it goes to show you that, it doesn't matter what you say. It's always possible to co-opt good ideas and misuse them and abuse them and deploy them in ways that are totally in bad faith and counter to the intentions of the author and the writing. And that's such a weird problem. And that also, I guess, speaks to his point that Christianity ended up getting co-opted by this dualistic thinking in the early centuries of the tradition. Right. And it didn't take long. And then all of a sudden, something that was clearly non-dualist, now it's dualist. Now it's an imperial religion. And what happened there? Just crazy. I also appreciate you mentioning that there was something very Catholic about the way Luther affirmed the body.
Yeah.
And I had another Reverend Doctor, Nancy Wright, was on the podcast recently. And so we were talking a little bit about Luther, and I was telling her, as somebody who's raised Catholic, I think Luther might be one of the greatest Catholics. For precisely that reason. So along those lines, I know you've thought more also about the Reformation and thinking about an eco-Reformation. So I wonder if you could speak to that, because I find that so fascinating. I mean, the Reformation was just such an amazing time in history, amazing point in the Christian tradition, and still something that we're trying to reckon with today.
And right. So I co-edited a book with Jim Martinschram called Eco-Reformation, Grace and Hope for a Planet in Peril, that includes essays from a bunch of different Lutherans on these questions of what does an eco-Lutheranism look like, or eco-Christianity more broadly. with this sense that, it was at the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, 1517, Luther nailed the 95 Theses on the door of the Castle Church, and 2017 was the 500th anniversary. And like, what's the Reformation we need today? Well, that seems pretty clear. Like, we're in this massive crisis, this polycrisis, and collapse beginning all over the place, and really scary time, and a lot of and unfit leadership on many scales, and people floundering and suffering as a result of such colossal mismanagement of everything, of the world. And so there's a lot of parallels to Luther's time in a very different context and very different situation. And but feeling the need to make change, to speak to change, and to point to the change that was needed. And so, of course, what is it for us but precisely this dualism, this attempt to construct Christian faith over the millennia, centuries, in a way that divorces God from world, that sets God up subtly or dramatically separate from the world, that has often cast the point or the goal of Christian faith as exiting the world to go to heaven when you die, rather than having anything. This world is a place of suffering and perhaps misery, and of course we need. And but rather than pushing for justice now, rather than acting for justice now, we have been taught, don't worry about that, you're going to go to heaven when you die. So Marx's critique that religion is the opiate of the people, it's can actively keep us from speaking and acting toward the needs for reform and reformation that are needed at the time. So how, in the spirit of Luther, could we speak and act at this time toward the eco-reformation that is so urgently needed to begin? What would it mean to dismantle this separateness of God and world, and to propose forms and visions of faith that knit these back together? And so the volume, it contains just a range, articles from a range of perspectives, from biblical work to homiletics to theology to ethics to, I did sacraments and outdoor sacrament stuff. There was another article on water and worship also. And so yeah, how that volume, you could say, was a more traditional perspective on knitting together God and world. It's not pantheistic, you could say. It's helping congregations, kind of like Nancy's doing, helping existing congregations look outdoors, move outdoors, think about the world, act, take seriously the faith implications of being Christian for the life of the world, and how we vote and how we act and how we treat the world. So yeah. And at the same time, yeah, I'm trying to push even further, you could say, into the Luther of the debates with Zwingli in 1527 on what does it mean to talk about the carnal nature of God, that like the Zwingli and others who were debating Luther about Eucharist were saying, because they thought he was too Catholic, they were saying, surely you can't believe that we would eat Jesus, right? You're going to put Jesus in your mouth and you're going to chew him up and swallow him and then shit him out.
Yeah.
Like, that seems really disgusting. That just totally diminishes the glory of God. That's appalling and disgusting, Martin, right? And he said, no, precisely that is the glory of God, that God wants to be incarnate in our guts and our bones and our blood and the life of the world and the tissues of the world and even the shit of the world. And I actually wrote an article called Holy Shit a month ago, trying to think theologically with shit as this great gift we give the world every single day to feed plants that we now treat as waste. And what would it mean to live in a world in which even our feces, could be this precious gift of life for the world, rather than the one we have set up where we separate that out, it becomes waste, it becomes poison, and where we separate out ethically people who live in countries to which we export our shit, you could say, our pollution and our and the detritus of our consumption, and those who don't. Like there's this ethical critique that emerges from honoring our waste that feels very Lutheran. So it was engaging, the article was engaging Lutherans in his debates against Zwingli. And what would it mean to really take seriously our embodiedness in its fullness and not divide out again, not differentiate some things are good, like these parts of me, but shit is bad. There's this, how do we think holistically, ecologically, incarnationally? And that to me feels very Lutheran. So it's, again, not a vision that all Lutherans share, but it's part of this, what I see as this big reformation that's needed toward thinking in a whole different way about the whole world and our part of it. We get to belong to this amazing world, right? Where every single day my body wants to feed plants and knows how to feed plants,
Right.
and could feed plants if only my world were set up in such a way that were possible, and this great reciprocity of life. So yeah, that's the eco-reformation I wish for.
I like it. I'll sign up. Absolutely, 100%. And I mean, I remember arguing with because I grew up in Texas in a very like evangelical kind of community, very conservative, and there weren't many Catholics around, and so like on the school bus, people would like ask me what church I go to. They find out I'm Catholic, and they're like, "Oh well, you worship Mary, you're going to hell," all kinds of really negative things. But
Right.
one of the things I remember arguing about was whether or not the bread is the body.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, the sacramental consciousness of a Catholic, of course, 100%.
Uh-huh.
And then I always felt like, man, like the Reformation really messed that up and making people think it's different. And then to find in people like Luther, he's like, no, I never said that. It's
Yeah.
still the bread and the body. It's still together. It's still one.
Yeah. Yeah.
And because obviously so many great things happened out of the Reformation.
Mm-hmm.
And I always felt like, well, that's all so much good stuff. But oh no, we lost the
Yeah.
idea that the bread is the body,
Yeah.
and to see that no, that's still there in
Yeah.
Luther, and so it is
Yeah.
still there in a certain type of Lutheranism.
Yeah.
So I
That's
find that
right.
very heartening.
Yeah. Yeah. It's what keeps me Lutheran, you could say, is
Right.
the fact that he did hold on to this sense of, yeah, the physicality of faith, the physicality of God, the physicality that we're all part of this, and that you can't talk about, like Luther doesn't say this, but you can't talk about Jesus is God in this high Christology way where his body becomes our flesh, right? And then say that's it, that's the end. Because in a biologically interwoven world, Jesus's spit and hair is part of this glass of water I'm drinking right now. Like we're completely interpermeated, and God becomes the whole thing in this. Just thinking biologically about the incarnation, it all is divine. Then you can't. It doesn't stop. There's no edge at the end, at the edge of Jesus, right? So yeah, this Catholic sensibility around that, and taking that in Protestant directions, if you will, and appreciating that as an ordained woman, being able to inhabit this highly incarnational sensibility and play with it and be creative with it. And like to me, it just points straight to pantheism. But in fact, I came up with a term with some friends. I was talking about this problem that pantheism doesn't preach, right? It's a big negative. And I was talking about how it's so incarnational. It's all about like I was just saying, like Jesus becomes the whole biosphere. The whole biosphere is divine. If Jesus of Nazareth is divine, the whole biosphere is divine. Like it biologically, and um and somebody said, yeah, they came up with a word, incarnational or something, and I shifted it and it became incarnality. So I want to propose incarnality as a better language than pantheism for Christians, that names the sense that the whole thing is God. The whole thing is God.
Yeah, I like that a lot, especially just to drop the baggage of the connotation that the word pantheism has.
Yeah,
And like,
yeah,
okay, don't think of that, or even pantheism, panentheism. People
yeah.
split all these hairs, and like,
Yes.
well, now
Yeah.
I feel like we're getting into these doctrinal debates that's kind of missing the point of the
Mhm.
carnality of it all. Like,
Yeah.
these aren't just
Yes.
ideas. This is about our
Yes.
actual living. This is our
Yes.
life. It's our connection to other species, to
Yes,
habitats.
exactly. Right. And
So
to
yeah,
celebrate that.
yeah,
Exactly. that we know how to feed plants, and that our bodies want to communicate with all creatures of all kinds, and that we're made for that. And
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
exactly.
celebrate that.
Yeah, and I think so much was messed up with the invention of indoor plumbing and toilets where you flush
Mm.
away wherever away
Away.
is.
That's right.
And I know I've some friends who have a farm on the coast in Marin
Mm.
County here in the Bay
Hmm.
Area, and they have a compost toilet set up,
Yeah.
which is against zoning rules. So I won't
Oh.
mention who these people are, but that's always such a joy. It's one of the treat.
Yep.
Anytime I go there, I'm like,
Yep.
"Ooh, the compost toilet,"
Yeah, that's
and
right.
there's something really oddly enjoyable about that because you feel like
Yes.
you're reintegrating into these natural
Yes.
cycles.
Amen. And that it's not odd, that is
Yeah,
enjoyable, that you're
yeah,
right. You're naming and experiencing something that we're all made for, that we want to be part of a reciprocal giving back, and a part of the ebb and flow and joy of life on earth. And that
yeah.
and that I can feed a plant is a great joy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I think that's so missing in a lot of, I guess, what we could just call environmentalism,
Mm,
is that it doesn't often have that joy. It's people just
mm,
critiquing capitalism or
mm,
industrial production and
mm,
overconsumption and things like that. It's like, hey, that's all great, but the joy of this work is
mm.
often lacking. And I think that's
Yeah.
one of the things that ecological theologians are able to articulate a lot. It's like,
Yeah.
actually, this
Yeah.
feels really good to do
Yeah.
this. It's
Yeah.
fun.
Exactly. It's fun. Yeah.
Well,
It's why I
speaking of
write.
other words, like incarnality, I know one that you also use is rewilding,
Yeah.
and which that's a powerful word in its own way. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about rewilding not just as like reintroducing
Mm.
wolves into an ecosystem that they haven't been in, but rewilding Christianity.
Yeah. 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 I use that term in a couple of article titles, and it's I've thought, like, rewilding implies that it used to be wild, and it probably used to be wilder, like Jesus himself lived outdoors
Right.
and baptized in rivers. So it's in that sense of rewilding, that it's about, but also taking it further and into what would it mean again to experience Christianity as a way of being human, that's fully incarnationally, fully embodiedly, fully uh, um, yeah, like sensorially in contact and connection with the larger natural world all the time. And that Christian faith invites us into those kinds of connections rather than taking us out of those connections into a separate human world. So so when I write about restoring the practice of river baptism, in baptism into local waters, which was the practice of the early church. So
Right.
rewilding in this case, back into the flowing rivers of that was the practice of the early church. And Jesus himself was baptized in a real river. And for a little while that continued and gradually moved indoors, along with broadly the larger indoor movement and the religion becoming the religion of the empire. Those
Sure.
all, broadly tracked together. So returning the practice of baptism to local waters means not just reclaiming the early church practice, but also, like, baptizing into the whole watershed I live in and into Earth's whole hydrology, and baptism being this wild immersion. So this sense that rewilding baptism, you know, is about baptism is what invites me, any alienated person, Christians becoming Christian means leaving all that eco alienation and obsession with texts and phones and the built environment and protection in the built environment and all the ways we wall ourselves off, and being physically immersed into the watershed, being physically placed underwater, and becoming part of the whole biotic community, which of course we always still are. Our bodies are, we're still part of
Right.
those it's just a perceptual alienation. It's not a physical one, but it's about baptizing physically as an experiential, perceptual reimmersion, that
Mm.
this is who we are. We're being physically brought back in. And I'm just convinced that we need these kinds of powerful physical experiences, that just writing books alone is not enough. We need to be, physically, experientially, sensorially out making these connections, and that the sacraments for Christians are super important rituals, of course, and baptism as the primal ritual, the initiation ritual, has the potential, if done outdoors, to recast completely what being Christian means. It means becoming part of this whole interspecies community I live in, and getting to know it, and learning to live here, in a way that doesn't destroy the rest of the beings in this place, but can learn to live lightly and humbly. And what would that mean for growing food? How would I eat if I really lived lightly and baptismally in this place? And being part of this whole biotic community that I'm being baptized into, as what Christian faith means. It's a whole different vision and experience than just being baptized into a community of humans throughout time and space, as wonderful as that is. But this is a whole different sense. So rewilding baptism, and with it, because baptism conveys the sense of what Christianity is, a whole different sense about that. And it's much harder. It's harder to baptize in a creek than it is in a bowl in a room. And you have to think hard about questions of access and questions of cleanliness. Is the water clean? And you have to learn to get to know the local scientists and work with the local activists to make sure the water's clean enough to put babies and adults in. And you get to know the people who live out on the riverbanks too, along with the otters and the herons. So it's risky. It's much riskier. It's much harder. You could get hurt. It's dangerous being baptized into the life of the world. So
right. I mean, for John the Baptist and Jesus, it was dangerous too.
Exactly. That's
that
right.
caused problems for them.
Yeah, that's right.
And just because you're signaling the emergence of this radical egalitarian community, and people are like, nope, we don't like this. So I appreciate that it's supposed to be risky, and that's because life is risky. And this kind of domesticated, safe version of Christianity is like, that's not what it was about. And so I think thinking of the wildness, I think is really exciting. I always think a lot about somebody who's very influential in my own thought, which is Gary Snyder, and talking about the practice of the wild.
Yes, the practice of the wild.
Yeah, which isn't about wilderness as opposed to culture. It's about wildness, which permeates all of the biosphere and all of our culture.
And us,
We're not separate from it.
Exactly.
I appreciate that a lot. I think, like with incarnality, these are words that can really activate the imagination and kind of enliven the soul in ways that different kinds of theism can kind of just put everybody to sleep. Like, look at all the different prefixes we have for the word theism. Like, okay, I don't know if that's getting it done. But I think rewilding is great. So I really appreciate your work along those lines, and really everything you're doing. And so this was great. I think I should let you go, because otherwise we're going to talk for a few hours. And I generally try to keep things close to an hour, just to be reasonable and to respect people's time. But we'll have to definitely do this again sometime, because I feel like we're just scratching the surface.
That'd be great.
And I'll have to also introduce you to my wife, who also does a lot of this work with religion and ecology. She's also a professor at the University of San Francisco. And she sometimes calls herself Dr. Outside, because she did some wilderness therapy work a long time ago. She's like, oh, I can't teach indoors now. And does a lot of outdoor education and tries to bring in the spiritual dimension, the kind of ecofeminist dimension.
That's awesome.
And I know, I'm sure she'll enjoy this episode, but also you two definitely need to talk sometime, because it's always so nourishing to be able to speak with kindred spirits like this.
It is. And it's so great to see this happening in so many other places. I was saying I felt all alone when I was beginning this process in the early 2010s, and just to find so many people who are having similar ideas and practices and coming together. So my friend Victoria Lures has founded the Wild Church Network, and there's now this communion of people doing Wild Church, and there's people doing all kinds of variations and versions and education, and like you're describing. And so it's so heartening. It's really hopeful. And I hope many people listening or not listening are can similarly find their own creativity and make it up yourself. Like
Yeah.
just start. It's just more fun.
Yeah, right. Yeah, just dive in,
Yeah.
to use the water metaphor again.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, and I think it was somebody in the Wild Church Network that my wife Kim had just plugged into, and they
Right.
mentioned some of your work, and then so I
Okay.
told her like a couple days ago, oh, I'm
Yeah.
interviewing Lisa Dahill in a couple days.
Yeah.
She's like, oh, you got to tell her, I know her work and want to connect more. So yeah, it is
That's
just so
great.
exciting to see this
Yeah.
emerge,
It's
and
super
it's really
exciting.
empowering. And
Mhm.
in tough times,
Yeah.
I'm still so hopeful. I was thinking of the Apostle Paul time, but
Mhm.
hope against
Mhm.
hope.
Yeah.
Like in hopeless times, it's almost like that enlivens hope more than ever.
Yes, it does.
Um,
And we need the connection to earth now more than ever. Like that is what gives us grounding. That's what gives us sanity. That's what gives us hope and connection and kinship that we're not all alone. And we feel so overwhelmed right now, perhaps. I do. And we just need to be physically and experientially and spiritually in connection with this larger world that's still here and it's still so beautiful and it needs us and we need it. And that time and presence outdoors just is the life of the world
yeah,
and for us too. So thank
yeah,
you.
yeah. Amen to that. Um, well, one of the ways I like to end episodes, because there's no easy way to end, I just say bye and stop the recording. Like that's not good. And so one of the ways I like to end is to have my guest give us one word or phrase. It doesn't have to be a single word,
Mm.
and that will, whatever it is, it could be anything, whatever
Okay.
might come to your heart or your mind.
Yeah.
And so a word or a phrase, and that will close out the episode for us.
Ooh. Um, well, yeah, I'm not thinking of something brilliant. I'm just back to, um, yeah, like go make it up yourself. Go be out and make it up yourself. See what emerges.